Well, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to welcome you and say thank you for taking time out of your busy workday to join us here for this session. My name is Genevieve Kirk, and I'm the Interim Director at the Community Foundation of East Central Illinois. I also run our Center for Nonprofit Excellence. And this session today is part of our new foundational fundraising series, which is something that we developed in response to what we heard from you, our nonprofit partners last year. You were asking us for more resources to help you and your nonprofit organizations to build sustainable funds. We ran a session on introduction to capital campaigns earlier this year. If you're interested in accessing a recording of that session, let me know. I'd be happy to send it to you. Today's session is on building endowments, and there's so much content to cover that we're actually doing this as a two-part series. So today is our introduction to building endowments, and then we'll have a follow-up session next month on November the 7th. So I'm pleased you're here. I will be sending out slides that our presenter is sharing with us after today's session. So if you registered for this, you'll get an email from me later with those slides. If you do like paper copies, I have a few paper copies in the back, and I'll be happy to pass those out after today's session. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce our presenter today. We are pleased to welcome Shari Fox, who is principal of Fox Philanthropic Advisors, to our session today. Shari brings a wealth of experience. She has more than 30 years of experience advising institutional donors in establishing and structuring their charitable gifts. Prior to establishing her company, she was senior vice president with the University of Illinois Foundation for 8 years, during which she had senior responsibility for their principal gifts and gift planning programs, as well as fundraising for special initiatives. Shari comes to us with a Bachelor's of Science in Business Administration, with a major in finance from Miami University, and her MBA with a concentration in management from Xavier University. Please join me in welcoming Shari.
Thanks, Genevieve. So thank you. I am really delighted to be here. I'm delighted to do anything with our local community foundation. One of the many gems, I think, in the Champaign-Urbana community, and I hope you all agree. With a small and mighty staff, they offer a great deal of resources for all of us in our community. And then to be here in the Champaign Public Library, which is also a great resource for our community and a gem and a reminder. You know, when I left the university and started my own firm, a lot of people asked my husband and me, because we're not from here originally, well, are you going to stay? And we're like, of course we're going to stay. Have you ever lived in Champaign, Illinois? It's a great place. Why are you asking us that question? So today we're gonna start these two sessions on building endowment. And as Genevieve said, it's the first part of a two-part series. So today we're going to start on some basic definitions and sort of those foundational building blocks of endowment. And then next time on November 7th, we're going to delve a little bit more into some of the policies that should be in place if you are starting or raising money for endowment, and talk about how to raise money for endowment. So that's probably the part a lot of you really want to delve into. But to be ready to do that, you need to have some of that foundational work done internally first. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Okay? So if you're ready, we'll get started. Let's see, maybe we'll get started. Okay, so here are our objectives for today. First of all, getting clarity on definition of endowment. I hear a lot of misperceptions of what endowment is and is not. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Also, there's actually 3 types of endowments, or at least 3 basic types of endowments. So we're going to talk about those and understand the differences, so that when you're speaking about endowment, you're well versed in what you mean and what your donors and boards might mean. I also want to bust some of the common endowment myths and misperceptions, and there's a few of them out there. And a few of you in the room and I have had just side conversations about some of that, so that may come back up to you. And then give you some of that ability to assess your organization's readiness for endowment, and know what you might need to do to be ready if you're not. Okay? Before we start, Is there anything else that you want to talk about? I can't promise we'll have time, but I'll do my best. Anything else you want to talk about endowment today? Did you come here like with, burning questions? And I love conversations, so please. Yes, sir.
One question our organization has is the mechanics of actually dipping into an endowment and using it, but that sounds like that might be more part two.
About how to, if you can and when you can?
Yeah.
Actually, that will be related to some of what we'll talk about today. So if we don't quite get there when we get to the questions, if that's not clear, let's talk about that. Some of it may be a little obvious from, okay? Anything else? That's a good one. I worked at an organization earlier in my career that used quite a bit of its endowment to start some new programs, and we'll talk about what that really was and why they could do that, although I will also say I'm not sure was the most prudent thing to do to the extent they did it. Yes, sir?
The advantages and disadvantages of an endowment versus a trust.
Okay. Two different things, but we can talk about that. Anything else? All right. All right, then let's get going. All right. We're going to start with some definitions, but first let's start out with what an endowment is not. It is not reserves. So if I'm on the board of an organization that had a couple of years, surprisingly, with money left over, where we actually did make a profit, which, by the way, not for profit means you're not established with the purpose of making a profit, like PepsiCo is, or Fox Philanthropic Advisors, maybe one of these days. But you can have a profit. So a lot of times then you'll take that profit and put it into reserves, right? This is not that. It is not a rainy day fund. It's not that money you set aside because you might need it later. It may really be a rainy day and the roof might leak, or one of your major funding sources might not come through for the year. It is not a bequest or any other estate gift. Okay? Those gifts might go to endowment, but it is not synonymous. Nor is it the fund that you have to put all of those estate gifts into. And it's certainly not a substitute for annual giving. Okay? And that also relates to a myth we'll talk about later. Any surprises up here? And I wonder, sir, if that might come with a question about the trust. It's different. A trust is a legal entity that can belong to an individual or an institution. But an endowment and a trust are two different things. Okay, so what is an endowment? Well, I'm going to give you a general definition of an endowment, which is a pool of assets donated to a nonprofit organization with the expectation that the funds will last into perpetuity while providing a stream of spending to support the organization's mission. That's what an endowment is, okay? A pool of assets donated to a nonprofit organization with the expectation that the funds will last into perpetuity. So the funds that were donated stay there while providing an ongoing stream of income for the organization's use, okay? There's also a formal definition legislatively. So MIFA, which is the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, mouthful, right? There was no quiz, so don't worry about that one. But that says it's an institutional fund or any part thereof not wholly expendable on a current basis under the terms of the donor's gift agreement. Okay? MIFA is a federal law that states chose to adopt or not. Most did, including Illinois, and they each kind of have their own spin on it. But if you notice in that definition, under the terms of the donor's gift agreement, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay? So there's no quiz on these definitions, but remembering that those primary pieces, donated money, meant to be kept in perpetuity and provide a stream of income. Okay. So let's talk about some of those myths, misperceptions, and fears. I love this picture, except that she's blonde and about 30 years younger than me. I know I have had that face looking at my computer, I don't know how many times, but she looks concerned. So we'll talk about some of these. Okay. One is that donors who give to endowment won't give, or they won't give as much to the annual fund. That is a myth. As a matter of fact, there's a national fundraising consulting firm called CCS, and they say that their experience suggests that many donors increase their annual fund giving after documenting a planned gift intention. And my experience, albeit limited, is that is absolutely the case, and it is the case for donors who make outright gifts to endowment. Okay, so there are many reasons that donors who support endowment typically continue to support annual fund, and sometimes more so. And if you think about it, they have now an even greater vested interest in your organization doing good work, right? They have invested in its future, so they're in. They're like your best customers. The second is if we have an endowment, donors will think we don't need their money. Actually, the opposite is often true. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about organizational readiness for endowment. Okay? And if you think about larger charitable organizations, Harvard, I don't even know how big Harvard University's endowment is now. University of Illinois' endowment is a little over $2 billion. People still contribute money, right, to those organizations to do ongoing work. So that's clearly a myth. Endowment gifts come only from planned or deferred gifts like bequests. Absolutely not true. People make outright gifts to endowment all the time. And when I worked at universities particularly, plenty of people would make gifts during their lifetime to establish endowment funds or to support existing endowment funds. So that's also a myth. And this is my favorite, is that we just don't have the staff resources to devote to building an endowment. We really have to focus on funds that support our current operations. And while I understand that, if you are an executive director, board member, development director at your organization, your job is to ensure resources are there to support the organization's work into the future. And I worked at an organization earlier in my career where we used to talk about the tyranny of the urgent, right? And that's often, we all get caught up in that, right? It's the stuff with the deadline today or tomorrow, or I've got to get this funded, or I've got to get we got the golf outing coming up, or we got this mailing going out. But then you'll never do this, and your successors will be in that same cycle that you are in. So if you don't do it, who's going to do it? If you don't allocate some time and resources to begin doing that work, when will that happen? Okay. All right. So those are some of our misperceptions. Now remember when I said that there are one of our objectives was to understand the 3 types of endowment. So these are the 3 primary types of endowment, and we're going to talk about each one. The first is what I would call true endowment or donor-designated endowment. And that's what that MIFA, anybody remember what that stands for? Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. I had forgotten, by the way, as I was preparing this, but that's what that definition refers to and talks about being important. So that's true endowment. Quasi-endowment is another type, and that's typically board-designated endowment. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And a third is term endowment. So those are the three flavors. Let's talk about the easier ones first. And the gentleman who asked about dipping into endowment, we'll talk, that relates to these. So a quasi-endowment is a fund that operates like an endowment, but the organization may spend more than the spending policy dictates upon action of the board. So if a donor designates funds as endowment and the organization accepts those funds, then you have a legal commitment that you're not dipping into those funds beyond what your organization's spending policy allows you to use. Okay, and we'll talk about spending policy a little bit more on November 7th, so you have to come. Okay, but a quasi-endowment, the board of the organization can take action, make a decision at a board meeting, or if that authority is delegated to a committee or an individual, to use more money if they need to. Okay. A quasi-endowment is most often established by action of the organization's board, but it can be established by a donor. A donor can contribute money and say this is going into a quasi-endowment fund. In other words, if I'm the donor, I really want it to operate like an endowment. I want you to use it as an endowment, but I also want you to have the authority. I trust the management will do that well to use some of those funds if you need to. Okay. Or I'm setting this up as a quasi-endowment for 5 years. And then we agree that at the end of those 5 years, it's going to become true endowment. Okay. Usually, the understanding is that it's going to operate like a true endowment for a period of time, for a minimal period of time, usually at least 3 to 5 years. Because if it's going to be invested like it's an endowment, right, and that has a longer time horizon. So the intent is that it's not, again, it's not reserves. And it's not a rainy day fund, that the hope is that it will be primarily used like endowment. Are there questions about that? I see a few knit brows. No? Okay. It's a quiet group. Yes? It's a bright light.
The set number of years is usually at the beginning of the fund, not sometime in the future. So
Right.
it starts out that way.
Yep,
Okay,
usually.
sure.
Yep. It can, I mean, there may be board action 2 years into the fund that says, it's our intention that we're going to continue to operate this as an endowment for at least another 2 years. But it's also not a requirement, even at the beginning. It's just an intention, to help guide how that money's used. Good question. John?
Can a term endowment be shifted to a quasi-endowment, or under what circumstances?
Yes, it can. So good question about a term endowment, which also operates like a true endowment for a predetermined period of years. So that is usually set up saying this will be an endowment for X number of years. And at the expiration of that term, the money is either converted to spendable funds, current use funds is another term there, reserve funds, this is going to become reserve, or into a quasi-endowment fund. So that's a good question, John. Yes. So a quasi-endowment can stay a quasi-endowment forever and operate primarily like an endowment with the flexibility. The main point here is that notice a quasi-endowment or a term endowment can be established by an action of the organization. Okay? Maybe it's that you've been building up reserves for a long time, and you really want to build that long-term stability, and we're going to take this much of our reserves, and it's going to become a quasi-endowment. We're going to treat it like endowment. Yes, sir.
Can a quasi-endowment or an endowment make a loan from the corpus? It's not considered spending, it has
Sure, a quasi-endowment can. A quasi-endowment can. A true endowment, so let's talk about true endowment a little bit, because true endowment is fabulous and more restrictive, because there are legal obligations that your organization takes on by accepting endowment. And notice I said accepting because, and I hear this used a lot, organizations, and this is not a criticism, the ones I've worked for have done this too, often use the term endowment to mean all of these, right? But a true endowment can only be established by a donor. So an endowment, a true endowment becomes such a thing when a donor contributes money and says, this is to establish an endowment, and you say, okay, we accept it with those terms. And by doing that, you've entered into a legally binding commitment to that donor that you are going to hold this as endowment and treat it as endowment. If, and this is, I am not an attorney, nor do I play one on TV, for those of you old enough to know where that came from. But to your question, sir, that's my understanding, if your policies for investment and management of true endowment allow you to lend money, then you can. And if your donors gave that money with that written understanding that it's governed by the organization's investment and spending policies, which most gift agreements for endowment would say that. And if your policies allow for that, then you can. And any of those issues, I would always encourage you to check with your own legal counsel. A true endowment is governed by the terms of the gift agreement between the organization and the donor and the policies of the charity, which I just mentioned. Investment and spending policy are two of the important ones. Investment policy says what are the parameters for managing the money, for investing the money. And the spending policy says, how do we determine how much of this can be used for our operations every year? Okay, and we'll talk more about that on November 7th. Now you all really want to come, don't you? I'm going to see every one of you on November 7th. Okay. Any changes to the purpose or use of the funds have to be approved by the donor in writing. Okay, you are accepting them. So if I create an endowment fund, if I give money to the Community Foundation of East Central Illinois and say, I am giving this to be an endowment fund to support early childhood education in Champaign County, whatever they distribute every year has to be used to support early childhood education in Champaign County. It can't go to the Eastern Illinois Food Bank, as wonderful an organization as they are. It can't come, it can't go to the Humane Society, nor can it go to early childhood education in Piatt County. Okay? And I would have to agree to change that purpose for them to be able to do that. And the other piece there about once the donor's deceased, if you want to change the purpose, you typically have to go to court. It's always good if there's living family to consult with them, get their support of that. But unless they were a donor who can change that purpose, you still have to go to court. Yes, ma'am.
Can the donor stipulate that when they provide the endowment, say, if you want to change the purpose, you're going to have to, if I'm dead, you have to check with my sons.
Yes, you can request consultation if the charity agrees to that. I recently worked with someone helping them create an endowment fund at a university in another state. And the language they would agree to is they would endeavor to consult with any living children.
Not stipulate.
That they were, right. And again, we'll get into this a little more next time, but there's a reason that a good gift agreement establishing an endowment fund has what's often referred to as an alternate use clause, which says how will that be dealt with if the purpose is no longer exists or is no longer practical for the organization to manage, okay? And don't stress too, I don't want to stress you out about that yet because that's later down the road, okay? So, and again, state law may apply. They usually does apply. Usually a gift agreement will say which state, usually the state of the charity's main office will govern the use of the funds, okay? So what are the charity's obligations when accepting true endowment? One is, yep, you're going to keep that in perpetuity, and that's a pretty long time, right? But think how cool that is. That means you've got that fund, which if you manage it well, it's going to grow over time, which means that stream of income will grow over time, and you're going to be a hero to your successors. They're going to have your picture on the wall for making this happen for them. That you're going to use the distributions for the purpose intended. And it can be for a designated program. My example is a pretty decent example of that. It's going to be for early childhood education. If it were to the Eastern Illinois Food Bank, maybe it would be for food mobiles. Are they still called that, right? Maybe that would be a designated program. It can be restricted, meaning only for a particular use. Or unrestricted, can be unrestricted to the whole organization. I'm looking at Becca, United Way. It could be an unrestricted endowment fund, and their board gets to choose how that fund is used all the time. Or it could be unrestricted for United Way's internal operations. She likes that one. Boy, did I get a smile. But, where I'm basically saying, I don't care whether it goes to support grant making or fundraising or building needs, but it is for your own operations. So that's designated unrestricted. That makes sense? So good example, and the less complex your organization, the less you have to worry about this. At universities, it's a big deal, right? So we have the director of the Cranard Art Museum in the room. I could create a designated endowment for the Cranard Art Museum that's unrestricted. John can choose to use that however he wants. Or I could make it restricted to acquisitions of American art. Okay. You're also obligated for whatever other terms are in the formal or implied agreement. Implied can be questionable, but this is where if things get ugly, you can end up in court. So you should have a gift agreement in place that governs those funds. And some endowment gifts are made at death, right? That you may or may not know of ahead of time. So if you find out you got a bequest from a generous individual who is giving you money and says it will be held in endowment for, and you accept it, you are obligated to those terms, to use it for what that donor said. Okay. So then the question is, oh my God, is it really worth it? Heck yeah. Yes.
Quick question, does all of this apply directly to a church, or are there different rules for churches?
No, it applies to a church as well, right, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Can you just go back one slide real
Sure.
quick?
And you will get, you weren't here, so you will be emailed digital copies of the slides, so don't feel like you have to copy everything
I
down.
learn better as I
As you write, I hear you, me too.
got it.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So a couple slides ago, you said that a true endowment is only established by a donor.
Right.
So you have to work with your donors and say, we really would like an endowment. Can you help us out and donate to an endowment? Is that the way to start that?
Well, to start a true endowment, yes. But your organization could start a quasi-endowment with its own funds. And donors could contribute to that if they are okay with the terms of that, right? Yeah. So, and we'll talk a little bit more in November about how to fundraise for endowment, but ideally, here's the advantage of talking with your donors ahead of time and having them know what your priorities are, is so you minimize the likelihood that you're going to get a bequest to something so restrictive that it's going to tie your hands or you're going to have to say no, right? So understanding your organization's priorities is important. A lot of people, though, endowment gifts can be unrestricted, and a lot of them will be. But if they say they're going to be held in endowment, then you still have to hold them in endowment. I don't know if that answers your question.
Partially, we're in a
What's behind
situation
that?
where we have
Yeah.
several donors who are talking about putting us in their bequest, but they want to give to a formal endowment, which doesn't exist yet. And so we're trying to start our own endowment that's not a quasi-endowment by registering it with the state and stuff. But it wouldn't start with a donor. It would start with the idea that donors want this already.
Right.
And so
Right, so that would really, if you're putting money in it already, it would be a quasi-endowment. And there's nothing you need necessarily to register with the state unless you're setting up a separate entity to hold that endowment, like a foundation. I mean, make sure you're getting good legal counsel there, but so, and your donors, you don't have to already have an endowment for donors to put you in their will for an endowment. And that's something, if you want to talk about that separately, we can talk, it's just they would put language, their bequest language would say this is to be held as endowment. And then if, for its unrestricted purposes, if that's really all they want, is that it's just it's a perpetual fund. You don't need to have any, as long as, once they make that gift and it's clear and you accept that, then it's held in endowment. That makes sense? You don't have to have established the endowment ahead of time. But it's good to have some of the policies and work done so that you're not behind the 8 ball when you accept that gift, when that gift actually comes in. Or maybe, even better yet, they'll make an outright gift to start the endowment. Maybe their big gift will come through that bequest, but maybe they'll consider giving you some money over a period of years now to help fund that endowment. So they can watch how that's used and know that you did a great job of managing that, so they'll feel particularly good about that bequest. Right? Yes, sir.
If you have a quasi-endowment, can a gift agreement supersede whatever the quasi-endowment says? For instance, if there's a quasi-endowment out there and I say, I want to give $50,000, but I don't want it to go to a sporting event.
Yep, then if the charity signs off accepting that with those terms, then
Sure,
yes.
yeah.
And that, which probably means you have to segregate those funds if the other funds go to a sporting event. Or you have to at least be able to account for it as a sub-account of the big account. Good question. All right, okay. I'm going to move on a little bit. So remember, one of my goals for today was to talk about how you assess your organization's readiness for endowment. So here are some basics that you should really have in place to be able to accept those endowment gifts that you were asking about. One is your board of directors has to be committed to building and managing endowment. If there's not an institutional commitment to endowment for the future of the organization, you're not going to be positioned to fulfill your donors' expectations, right? So your senior executives and your board need to be committed to endowment for the long haul. You need to have a financially stable organization with a clear mission and a strategic plan. Okay, remember the myth about donors viewing organizations with endowment as too wealthy and they don't need my money. No, what it says is you are committed to managing your finances for the good of the organization and that you are thinking long term. And you need a compelling case for support for the endowment. Why would I consider investing a significant portion of my money in your organization? Okay, why would I? So your donors need to know the answer to that question because they're choosing to take that money and invest in outcomes in what you do, rather than investing it for their own financial return or their own vacation in Italy. My best friend just landed in Italy today, so I'm a little green with envy. Okay. Questions about that? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, don't be sorry.
Endowment versus foundation. My understanding, an endowment can be part of a foundation, or an endowment can just be in your organization.
Exactly. A foundation is a legal entity. So it's a separate corporation, usually a 501c3, not-for-profit corporation, but there's other forms. But right, many, if not most, foundations hold endowment, but you do not need to have a separate foundation to have an endowment. And whether it would behoove you to do that or not is a conversation to have with your attorney and perhaps accountant. But it is not typically required unless there's something in your organization's bylaws that would require that. Right, Becca?
I was just going to give the example.
Yes,
Our
please.
institution has endowment funds. We don't have a foundation. Part of our endowment funds are held at the community foundation. Part of our endowment funds are held at a financial institution in the community. And we have a board entity that manages how those funds are managed. But we don't have a foundation. But we do have a financial institution that's managing that for us.
Yeah, you typically need outside expertise to manage the investments. I mean, large organizations like universities and major healthcare systems and institutions might have an investment office with that kind of expertise. But most charitable organizations, their boards establish the policies under which those investments are managed and then hire one or more outside managers like a financial institution. Okay, it's a good question, the question about a foundation. And for those who most of you probably know Becca, but she's with the United Way, so that's a good example because that's a broad mission organization. So let's talk about that case for endowment support. These are the questions that a case for support should answer. What is the need? Okay? What is the need that this money will be used to fill? What's the evidence for that? How do you know that's a need? What will the impact of my gift be on that need? What will me supporting the endowment help to do? What will the endowment do to make a dent in that need? And why is your organization well positioned to meet that need? So really, if you think about it, it's really why this and why us. Why this, why us in the long term. Okay. So, and one of the pieces of advice I would say is the more specific you can be in answering those questions, the more compelling your case for support. So, we have a little time today. Why don't we take some of that time to practice starting to build your case for support? So I'm going to give you time. I'm not the boss of you. You're not going to answer to me. But here's those questions again. Why don't you we'll take about 10 minutes and start answering those questions. And if you came with a colleague from your organization or a board member or a volunteer, work together on that. There are pens, and there may be some paper back there, I think, also. There's lots of Fox Philanthropic Advisors pens. Please take one. If they're extra, take some for your friends. I have a lot of them. So take some time and start answering these questions. Just jot down some notes. They're things for you to then take back with you and continue to work on, maybe between now and the next session. Okay, and then we'll come back together at about 10 till. Oh, thanks. You want me to pick? It was on my calendar, Belinda. I had it on my calendar, but now I've got the details. Yeah. Sure.
Can endowments, so we're actually from United Way.
United Way, which United Way, I'm sorry?
Pardon me?
Which United Way, I'm sorry?
In Danville. Of the
Okay,
area.
okay, great.
So I know they just had their 100-year anniversary.
Yeah.
And so,
And they're talking endowment a lot these days.
they are. I know that's one of Sue's big things. Our 100-year anniversary will be in 2027. So we actually are going to have United Way will actually do our study for us to see if we're ready. You know,
Oh,
we'll be
great. They're
ready.
gonna do
They will
readiness
come in and do
assessment.
do
Great.
a plan to help us with our plan. However, can the endowment, that type of endowment, as we look to our 100-year anniversary, I mean, we would like to use that to start our endowment. Can that fund salaries to, I mean, like there's just Karen and I. So how can you make that case to fund salaries? You know what I mean?
I do know,
Operational
yeah, I know,
support, you know what I mean?
right. So let's just have a conversation. Why are salaries at United Way important?
Well, because we are the ones that are going to go out and connect with everyone in the community, the policymakers, the workplace campaigns, the individuals that are going to be making the donations without us.
And why do you need to do that?
Why? Because without us, there's no one to get donations.
When you think about that more from the community impact side, and you would be good to speak because that's part of what your endowment is.
We're in the middle, and we've actually had
And you guys have
some
a
of
very
the
large
funds.
staff compared to us.
Yeah, but that was, one ask in particular, he just felt very strongly that my position, which is a fundraising role, should be, so his entire IRA is going, which is significant, will go, the return of what, it goes to the endowment, but then
To support the development director's position.
the role that I have, because he just feels very strongly. But what it's about is not about me or about raising money.
Yeah, because you may not be in that role when you get
It's
it.
very compelling that, 100 years is a long time. What have we done for the last 100 years? Why is it critical that we continue to do this for the next 100? And what what does staff stability, staff professionalism mean for an organization of our type? It means that we're able to work at a level and to provide programs and really to provide processes for our community's nonprofit sector that strengthen the community, that meet current needs in a quick and responsive way, which is what United Ways are known for, right? To assess the need, address the need, assess the need, address the need. That's what makes us unique. And so I think sharing that with supporters is very compelling. I mean, really, almost all of our our 100th anniversary campaign is about $5.5 million, and so far, and of that, about just under 5 is endowment. The rest is current use. And of that 5 million, all of it is either undesignated or operationally focused, which is really undesignated also. So it is a compelling for United Ways, especially as Shari mentioned earlier.
So if you think about what you're doing is you're making the case, what does United Way do for that community? Having staff allows United Way to do those things. You need staff in order to make that happen. If there's an endowment to support staff, salary, support operations, I would try to make it a little broader because that allows it to be, right, then, because most of United Way's operational expenses are staff, right? It's not like, you don't have heavy machinery, you don't have a lot of land, you might have rent or expenses of building. So, but that then allows a greater percentage of all of the donated money to go directly to addressing the needs of the community. That's how you're making that case. You can't address the needs of the community without the operations. And if there's money there to support the operations, then you're not reliant on as much of those annual donations to support.
Are you working with UW Next for your feasibility study, or who's going to do your feasibility
Yeah,
study?
I've only been there 2 months, and I just had a meeting with them, and they said that they would probably need to find out when.
Are there any questions I can answer for anyone as you're working? Hi. So how are things going? Yeah. Are you looking to build more endowment? I'm sure you are. Yeah. Just say I know you've got the U of I Foundation to help, but. And you don't have to worry about policies and those kinds of things because those exist. But yeah.
And it's for the community engagement and learning piece, which would escalate the last few years. The team is like ready to do more. We can prove that we've done great work. We need to scale it up.
So thinking about that case for support, that part is important. That's what you really have to develop.
Yeah. And that's always the question when we talk to folks about endowment versus current use, right?
And you always, some donors, there are donors who they don't want to give to endowment.
Yep.
They just don't. They want it all used, and that's fine. You definitely can use those funds. I always remember those who they wouldn't give to the endowment because they would invest the money better. So there were always that.
We totally have that guy.
Yeah. I think I know who that guy is. And okay, as long as you're going to continue to support us on a significant basis, then
And they want to spend the money now.
Yeah.
In a big way.
Right. And
the
so
idea of building interest when they're 93
yeah.
is
Yeah.
it's not so appealing.
Well, and there's, it's funny because just like there are people who will give to building and love giving to building projects, and there are those who never will. Mm-hmm. There was somebody I worked with when I was at, you should forgive me, the University of Michigan. I didn't work with him a lot. I actually came into this one gift for some technical support of how he might structure it.
Right.
And very generous gentleman. And he was, there was a building project for the School of Music, and he never gave to building. And it was interesting because when I got on the phone with them, and so-and-so suggested we talk about blah, blah. And he said, because you know, Shari, he said, I'm not a building guy. And I said, I know, I never think of you as a building guy. I think of you as a student guy. And he said, this is a good case for support. And he said, exactly. But he named the choral director, whom he liked a lot, and he convinced him why part of this building project was so important for students. They didn't have enough. They didn't have enough practice rooms. They didn't have, and so that was because it's not, in most cases it's a little different for a museum, but it's not about the building. It's about what even for a museum, what the building allows you to do.
Right.
It's not the bright shiny object, the building. And if it's education, it's what it makes possible for students, right?
Exactly.
If it's lab space, it's what it's anyway. So that's part of this case for support. Is thinking about it that way. Yeah.
I'd love to sit down with you maybe over lunch or
I'd
something.
love that.
Okay.
I think the
Some
world of you.
thoughts about some potential changes.
Oh, okay.
So I just
Yeah, anytime. I brought, there's some cards back there somewhere by the pens. So, and the minimum order for those things is 300.
but no phone number on the pen. Okay.
No pen, no pen.
Well, you're easy.
Yeah, with Fox Philanthropic Advisors, there's a lot of characters to get on a pen. I didn't put anything else on there. Yeah, and I'm in TED. You can always get a hold of me.
And you're
I'm
loving the work.
I am. I'm really enjoying it. It was just kind of the right time in my career. This is the last chapter for me, and doing my own thing. And I'm working with some great. I love working with the Community Foundation. I mean, I have been since I went independent. And I have a couple of other charitable organizations I'm doing work with, and working a lot with financial advisors. And I actually have a contract. I'm working with Busey Wealth Management to help build out their philanthropic services and work with some of their clients. So, yeah, so it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was of course so sad.
Oh, thank you. Well, and I have.
But then when I heard what you were doing, I'm like, well, okay.
How's Brenda? I see her on social media every now and then. I miss seeing you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
She just keeps going.
Yeah, she does. It's a good thing.
I know. I mean, that's the knowledge that she has is just in this field in particular.
Right. And the consistency. I mean, it's the consistency for people. All right, I'm going to call people back, I think. All right, how was that feeling? Did you get some notes, even just some thoughts? In one of the conversations I was having, it reminded me about, again, when you think of this, think of it from an impact. Like I was reminiscing about, in a previous life, a donor who, you have, like if you're ever doing a building project, you're building a building or you're renovating a space, and there's some people who love giving to that, and some people who don't. But when you think, if you're talking about building, why do you need that building? I spoke with somebody when I was at not this university, but another one, who said to me as I was talking to him about how we might structure a gift to a building project, he said, Shari, I'm not a building guy. And I said, I know, I don't think of you as a building guy. I think of you as a student guy. And what had happened was a faculty member who he ran a program, and he had a great deal of respect for this faculty member who talked to him about why this building project was so important for the student's educational experience. That's why he was supporting it. The reason I give you that example is for endowment, we had a conversation about an endowment for operations and why that's so important for someone like United Way, and why Becca's organization has been building endowment that way, is what does that allow you to do? Why is you've got to have the operations to be able to assess the needs in the community, raise the money, and allocate it wisely across the community, right? So remember that. I think the case for support is the most important thing to have. Why would somebody give money to endowment for your organization, right? Okay, yes, sir.
When you establish an endowment, and like you just said, do you stay vague on what you're going to use the money for, or do you get specific?
Well, if you're the organization, that's up to you, because then it's quasi-endowment and you're making the rules. So most quasi-endowments established by most organizations are just for them, in support of their work. So it can be used for anything that fulfills the organization's mission.
But if a donor comes along and says, I want it only for scholarships for kids, and you accept that agreement, that's fine.
Scholarships for kids. And if they're, blue-eyed blonde kids from Tolono, then you got to give it to blue-eyed blonde kids from Tolono. So that's something, so those are why ideally they're conversations. Plus there are some restrictions, like that's probably a bad example because there's some laws about some of that. But yeah,
It
Matt,
seems like you could do a whole session on gift agreements. And
I probably could.
what makes a good one and what makes a bad
Yeah.
one. And that's a good example.
Yeah, I'm actually doing that with the team of a wealth management firm next week. So yeah, because they wanted to understand that because their clients come to them for advice sometimes. Yes, sir.
So if you have multiple donors that have very specific donation, then is the verbiage then you have multiple endowments because this donor wanted it, and this donor wanted it, so you don't have one endowment anymore.
They may be pooled for investment purposes, but yes, if they each have different restrictions. So like when you look at a university's endowment, it's typically like the University of Illinois' endowment is made up of thousands of individual endowment funds. It can be, especially if it's a named fund. So part of those policies are what minimum amount does it take to establish a separate endowment fund? Because you're going to have to account for that and report on that, et cetera. Good questions. Again, I'm going to lift us up from that a little bit at this point, because what I really want you to focus on, I don't know all of your organizations, I know some of them, but is to start with, really focus on, are you ready? Are you ready for endowment? Is what you're trying, if you want to build endowment, start with this. Start with being able to articulate why that's important. And if your organization has the funds to begin seeding an endowment, that's great, quasi-endowment. And then talk to donors about why this is important. And build those policies that we'll talk about a little bit more next time to be ready for those. Okay? Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
So
And
if
I'll
you
get
have
to
a true endowment, and you have a pool of assets that are invested long-term, and a donor comes to you and said, hey, this is a restricted gift for the endowment, are you essentially you're taking care of that on the accounting side of things, in just earmarking that this is a restricted gift,
Right.
but it's all pooled in the same legal entity, it's all invested as a group of assets?
Right, unless they want it invested a certain way that you agree to. But if it's true endowment, I don't advise that. You should have policies, that govern the parameters within which that's invested. What kinds of investments can there be? What's the asset allocation? And yes, it's all pooled. So at the U of I, for example, it's not that every one of those is in a separate account and invested. They're all commingled, and then accounted for separately. And if your organization doesn't have the expertise, or the staff to do that sub-accounting, then there are firms that can help you do that, or the community foundation. Excellent point. Thank you, Becca.
And then the gift agreement or the gift acceptance policy, I don't know if those are the same things I've heard.
I'm sorry, say that again.
A gift acceptance policy or a gift agreement, are those the same things?
They're related, but they're different.
Okay.
The gift agreement governs that specific gift. The gift acceptance policy is your organization's policy about what kind of things it will accept, and under what terms,
Okay,
right.
I wanted to make sure those were different. And then
Yeah.
I guess with that, the gift agreement, is that something that you just do standard with everyone that would give to an endowment?
I would recommend that you have a standard agreement. Your donors may wish to have additional or revised terms in some of that. And so your gift acceptance policies, as well as discussions you will have in those negotiations, will determine whether you'll make any of those changes or not. Okay. Yes, sir.
If an organization does not have an endowment, but they've got some reserves that are unrestricted. Can they create an endowment without having to go back to all of those donors and get agreement?
Sure. As if they were reserves that, unless there were specific restrictions that those donors put on that money, but if it's just reserves because it's excess, it's some money that was set aside because of good cash flow years, then no, that you can absolutely establish a quasi-endowment fund with any portion of that money. You, the organization, can do that. You do not have to go. Now, if the donors specifically restricted it for any purpose, then that's a different story. Yes, sir?
Yeah, is the spending policy of the organization required to be consistent with keeping the capital in perpetuity, or
That's a good question.
in
We'll talk
constant
about
dollars or not?
Yeah, so it is, according to MIFA, if it's true endowment, it has to be, it does need to have the intent that the original gift is kept in perpetuity over time. It doesn't mean that you, and MIFA specifically says, let me back up a minute. From an accounting standpoint, there's principal and then there's income. And technically, accountants would say income is dividends and interest, right? So some old investment policies used to be you could only use true income, either all of it or a percentage of it. Well, that means, first of all, it's pretty limited on what you can use, and it will often incentivize an organization to invest for income, which means you're not going to get much growth in that principal. MIFA allows you to use a total return approach so that you are able to use some of that growth over time, what's called the corpus, that original amount. So if I give you $10,000 of your organization, $10,000, and you're investing it, that $10,000, hopefully a few years from now, is worth $20,000. So it allows you to cut into some of that $10,000 growth. We'll talk about spending policies next time, so I hope you'll come. But it allows you to, but yes, the intent is that, and good management for endowment is that you are looking to grow its purchasing power over time, right? Because we all know what we could buy for $100 3 years ago costs us more today. It's going to be the same for your staff salaries and any of the other expenses you have. I think you said you're with a church for fulfilling the mission of that church and serving your congregation, right? Yes, ma'am.
When you said the old policy, only income could be used, it was interest and what else?
Income, it would be interest and dividends. So, and there's a lot of other things. If there's real estate in there, you might have rental income, but it's regular income. Beyond the scope of this, you're going to make me into an accountant, which I'm not. All right, so next time, and I can stay around for a few minutes if people have questions, but I want to respect that I've already gone 5 minutes over. Sorry, Genevieve. So again, it's not the 24th. I'm not good enough to figure out how to change that. But November 7th at 1 p.m., so ignore that pen. Here's what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to do a policies primer, and we're going to talk about gift acceptance policy, and we're going to talk about investment policy and spending policy. And we're going to talk about raising gifts for endowment, raising outright gifts, and raising planned gifts or deferred estate gifts, okay? And a little bit about sustaining momentum. And so I also hope those of you who have, like Becca and some others, John, who do talk to donors about endowment, have started raising money for endowment or have been doing that over a long period of time. Please come with your stories too, because nobody wants to hear me talk the whole time. All right? So with that, thank you very much. If anybody wants, I have some business cards in the back as well. If you want to reach out to me to talk about anything following this. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today. I hope it was helpful.